Has anyone heard of the dying soldier from The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time? Many simply pass by him in the back alley of Hyrule Castle's market town. But in the finished game, he appears right after you get the Ocarina of Time, and tells you to go to the Temple of Time. After telling you this, he stops moving and is presumably dead. However, in an early build of the game, he played a very different role, and led you to a very different place. Just like many who played the finished version, many testers passed over the dying soldier. Those who found him were treated with a surprise. For finding him, they were given a key to Hyrule Castle. Some testers thought this key would lead them to the Triforce, as the key had a Triforce symbol engraved upon it. They followed the tip the soldier gave and entered the path leading to Hyrule Castle. When they entered, they noticed something was off. There were no guards protecting the grounds from trespassers. The gate was open. The sound was mute. As this was an early build of the game, some testers thought this was a simple glitch or a bug. They eventually found their way into an all-new section of Hyrule Castle and continued until they ended up at a locked door. They used the key given to them by the soldier to unlock this door. Link opened the door very slowly after unlocking it, as if he didn't want to enter. But eventually the door was opened, and Link walked into the darkness. A new environment opened up. It was the hall you could see through the window when you first meet Zelda. Ganondorf wasn't present, and the guards were nowhere in sight. But there was something that the testers would never forget. On the other side of the room, they saw the bloody remains of the King of Hyrule. Most of the testers screamed, and some even stopped playing. It was quite a horrific sight. They assumed the king was dead. But when Link walked up to him, a text box opened up.
He said he would bring help, not a child.
When I was a child, one of my favourite games was The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Anyone who's played it can probably figure out why, even if they don't particularly find it their favourite. Naturally, as a very popular game, it spawned a lot of rumours and legends, especially back in the day when communication through internet wasn't as common. Most of these legends are false, but sometimes a surprising amount of truth can be found in them. A while ago, I had read an article about the early versions of Zelda 64, as it was called in development. Apparently these early versions were incredibly different than the released version. It was modelled after the original Legend of Zelda, rather than A Link to the Past, and as such, it was a lot freer roaming and adventurous than the one we had got. At the time, it sounded awesome. I even found myself wondering why they'd abandoned the project. I concluded it was probably due to the technical requirements of such a feat. Still, one thing that especially struck me were the pictures. Some were nondescript, nothing special. However, one showed an expansive desert environment. There was just a palm tree, and a small oasis near a much more primitive looking Link, as well as some enemies. Past that, however, was just sand, stretching across the horizon. The thoughts of what might lay beyond that desert seemed to stick the image in my mind. Skip several years later, and the article was only a vague recollection. Nothing important. I was hanging out at a local game shop with one of my friends. He was telling me about his day, and he gets into a story about how some guy came to him to sell his missing son's old video games. He got them out and showed them to me. They looked like normal games, actually. There were a few Wii games, some GameCube games, and a lot of Nintendo 64 games. The one that really caught my eye was a red cartridge with no label, except for a piece of tape with the word Zelda written over it with marker. Naturally, this got me curious. My friend didn't share my curiosity and mentioned that he didn't think he could sell the game, so he let me take it home for free so I could indulge myself. Excitedly, I took it and went home as soon as I could. The moment the game started, I realised this wasn't the same Zelda I was used to. The screen was comprised of nondescript text that said, "The Legend of Zelda," There were no subtitles or fancy font, not even music. It was just those words, blackboarded and white text. The background wasn't from Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask. It was an overhead view of what could only be called some ancient ruins. They looked very sinister and grotesque, similar to something from Majora's Mask, only without the hint of mythical atmosphere that usually accompanied Zelda games. They were really unnerving. Still, this didn't stop me. It only kept me going. As soon as I pressed start, the game began. It skipped over any file screens and dumped a very blocky-looking Link into an empty black environment. Though when I say black, I mean black. There was nothing separating the ground and the sky. There was only blackness. The only thing that led me to know the game had even worked was what looked like a temple in the distance. From what I could tell, it was similar to the one in the opening. Moving still seemed to work fine, suggesting that something had glitched with the textures of the environment. It seemed strange that nothing happened to any other textures, though. Entering the temple was my only choice, since I couldn't see to get anywhere else. So I took it. One thing worth mentioning at this point is that the game started with no music, only deathly silence. The closer I came to the temple, however, the more music was available to hear. It wasn't really music, though. It sounded more like moaning, similar to the Redeads in Ocarina of Time, but tinnier and badly recorded. Every once in a while, some sobs could be heard, but they were quickly stifled. Entering the temple seemed to make everything more like a Zelda game, but something strange caught my eye. Rather than the textures being worse than those in Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, they were actually better. There was more detail in everything, but it was dingy and rotten looking. Extra polygons only served to make things look more grotesque. The random blood splatters didn't help anything either. It didn't take long for me to realise that the entire dungeon could hardly be called Zelda-like. Puzzles usually consist of only pulling a lever or pressing a switch. In fact, there weren't even any sliding blocks. There were no enemies either, but the blood splatters on the wall and the floors soon served to be warnings of traps. Some became escapable and sent you back into the darkness again. Others were escapable, but were extremely creepy and quite depressing. The dungeon was riddled with low polygon remains of old adventurers, and sometimes they even had items on them. The items could be picked up, but the game only auto-equipped the first 3 items picked up, since there was no accessible inventory screen. After several gruesome deaths and retries, I found my way to a door marked with a scratched-on eye, similar to the one on the Lens of Truth and other various objects in the Zelda universe. Entering the door reveals a boss battle. The music, by this point, has changed. I only realised it by the last room, but the moaning had never looped once, only seemed to change according to mood. A discordant violin medley began to play, but the rest of the sound remained nothing but moans, sobs, yells, and a strange scratching. It was never enough to rise past the level of background noise, but it still remained unnerving. It was almost as if it wasn't music at all, but there were monsters wandering somewhere in the temple. And when I said entering the door revealed a boss battle, I wasn't entirely honest. It could only be called a boss battle by the most generous standards. It featured an empty room that looked similar to the rest of the temple in every way. The only out-of-place aspect was a giant face on the other side of the room that was about the same colour as the surrounding walls. Its skin seemed to stretch over its head and had lined up with the wall, so it looked as if the wall was growing a face. Moss seemed to be growing over its closed eyes, and cracks were apparent everywhere on it. The door to go back was locked, so the only thing I could do was approach it. I did so in a careful fashion, making sure nothing was waiting for a surprise attack. I walked up to the point where I was nearly in contact with the face. Nothing. It was still there, with its sunken eyes and its cracked lips. I attacked it with my sword, and the sword went right through it, and made an incredibly vulgar, flesh-ripping sound. But nothing else happened. The face remained there, and I attacked it some more, and still more. Soon, the cacophony of violin music became even louder, and the moans started up stronger. After that, the face's eyes opened, staring at me with its dry, soulless gaze, and then nothing. I continued to attack the face, with no reaction until it had enough. It went to shreds before falling away in fire, in the typical Zelda fashion, and revealing a door. The music had stopped. There were no more moans or screams. Nothing at all. I went through the door. What a fool I was. That was only the tutorial. The screen turned white, followed by a moment of extremely loud static. I jumped, but it was over almost instantly. What faded in was an almost endless desert, the one from the image from so long ago. I was in shock. By that point, I was creeped out enough to turn the game off. The respite didn't last that long. I had dreams about the game. Sometimes even nightmares. They showed me what I hadn't even realised while playing the game. Something that scared me. The game changed each time I started over. When I tried to take the same path through the labyrinth, I always ended up lost and confused. By the time I got to the end, I was relying only on instinct. I kept playing the next day, stopping only to eat and go to the bathroom. When I turned the game on, I was still at the desert, despite the lack of a file screen. This time it was night. I walked. Sometimes I would walk for 20 minutes, only to find a half-sunken obelisk in the ruins of what looked like some village, but other times I would see great expanses of oases and tropical forests. They were similar to tektites, with larger bodies, and mostly contained their large eye. They had long thin legs, and would still attack by leaping, but if they hit you, they would pin you to the ground. Soon the sun rose, and I continued on. Sometimes I would find small tombs. These were almost always similar to the style of the first dungeon, only without the moaning and with no bosses. However, I would also find information. Runes were scribbled onto the walls and could be read. The descriptions were always vague, with phrases like, "And knowledge shall guide the way to the heavens." Sometimes they would be followed by other comments, but most of the writing seemed glitched and unintelligible. However, it seemed to be a sort of history. The maps I'd often find confirmed that. I simply explored, and after a while I learned to let instinct guide my way. I soon found the next dungeon, a large pyramid rising out of the desert upside down. Over it, straight to the sky, was another large upside down temple. It stretched way too far for me to see, but I couldn't keep going. I needed sleep again. The next day came and I entered the dungeon. It was like all the small tombs I would find, just a bit more perilous. There were more bottomless pits, chasms, spike traps, and monsters this time. Long arms would grab you from out of the wall, similar to the Wallmasters. These simply threw you into the traps and killed you though. They were probably what used to be Redettes and skeletons. At the end of this dungeon, I found a large spiral staircase. I followed it up until I reached what seemed to be the top. It took 2 hours of climbing, but the time seemed to fly by. The top was merely a platform with a large ornate arrow pointing off an edge. Since there was nowhere else to go, I jumped off. The screen flashed white again and I was in a new area. This routine went on for the next few weeks. There were many places to visit and, at times, I couldn't find the borders of where one locale met the other. I started to name the locations I had been to, although I started knowing all the places intimately. There never seemed to be an end for new locations. There were even times where I would go through one door and come out the other side of the world. Places didn't behave by the constant rule of space, but it became easier to find my way regardless. Each time I revisited a place, it was rearranged in a difficult, more navigable setup. From every corner, however, I could see the tower in the distance. I quickly realised that I had not reached the top, only fallen into one of the many traps. To this day, I still haven't reached the top. In the few times I took a break from the game and went about the real world, I could tell the game was different. It changed itself. It seemed to react to me. I was sure that a game like this could not be created. But they were going for a more free-roaming experience, more similar to the original Legend of Zelda. What if they succeeded? What if they'd created a world one could always roam? I think they really did create that world. I had learned of the many gods in that land, the three goddesses, who had created such a perverted physical world, and the god, he who sees, who decided to cleanse it. I still didn't know my own role, but I felt that if I simply followed my instincts, I could find my goal. This is why I'm recording this now. My instincts still tell me where to go, but it's not here, it's not in the game. I have to leave, and I will, but before I go, I feel I have to leave this message for someone to find. I should warn you, it may be a game, but it does know you're playing. A few months ago, I noticed a small classic video game store that had seemingly popped up out of nowhere on a street I walk by quite often. I'm always on the lookout for a variety of older, hard-to-find games, so naturally, I went inside. It was a very small shop, about the size of a bedroom, with wooden walls that were bare except for several video game posters on them. They looked like the kind you got in issues of Nintendo Power, but they weren't exact matches. There was an Earthbound picture of a frightened Nez staring at the background that shows when you fight Gigaius, a poster of Sonic in a drowning position under a very dark underwater city, and several others. Sadly, the collection of games wasn't very good. They covered systems going all the way back to the Atari 2600. They only had about 10 or 20 games for each. Most of them were crappy ones, or ones that everybody had. I couldn't seem to find anything I was interested in, and I was about to leave until something caught my eye. It was a gold Ocarina of Time cartridge. I already had the game, of course, but I had to examine this cartridge because of how beaten up it was. The cover was almost entirely torn off. The plastic was cracked and chipped in places, and there was something that looked like a burn mark on it. The cart was only $1.99, and to be honest, I felt drawn to buying it. The clerk didn't say a word to me, he just took my money, and I left with the cartridge. After leaving the store, I started to wonder why I'd brought a copy of the game I already owned, especially one in such a horrible condition. It's just an impulse purchase, I guess. Since I had it though, I decided to see if it worked. I put it in my Nintendo 64, and when I turned it on, I was immediately greeted by dead shrieks against the solid red screen. I turned the system off, pulled the cart out, did the typical blow trick, and I put it back in, and tried again. This time I saw Zelda's character model lying face down, slowly rotating, while Ganon's laugh played. I tried the same method again, and I actually got to the intro screen. I had a slowed down version of Hyrule Castle Town's music playing, and the game didn't seem to want to respond to the controller input. I knew that cartridges were capable of some rather odd effects when they were broken or tampered with while a system is turned on. I'd heard about cart tilt in Nintendo 64 games, and since I wasn't going to be able to play the game anyway, I decided to try and mess with it. I put the game in once more, getting some glitchy character models, while what sounded like cymbals crashed repeatedly. I started slowly tilting the car, and to my amazement this made the game boot the intro screen with the normal music and started responding to the controller again. 2 of the files already had saves on them, so I selected the third and started the game. The game started with the Deku Tree's monologue, but the text was different. He said,
"Death is the only thing this cursed land is good for. The cruel goddesses created life only to toy with it and to laugh in the pain of those they gave it to. I wish for death. I wish for death. I wish for death."
The last sentence repeated itself several times, filling up 6 text boxes. The game finally switched to Link, who was in the middle of having a nightmare. It happened normally, more or less. Ganon did have Zelda's face. Link woke up with a scream, and there was no Navi, so he got up on his own. I had control of him, so I exited Link's house. There were no visible characters in Kokiri Forest. I couldn't seem to get into the houses either, and the hole you crawl through to get the Kokiri sword was missing. Since Mido wasn't there, I went directly to the Deku Tree without any problems. No cutscene played, but the dungeon was open, and I went inside. The dungeon looked nothing like the one in the normal game. It looked more like the inside of the castle. There were no enemies, and I didn't have any items, so I explored. As I went from room to room, I could hear children's laughter getting louder and louder. When I finally found a sword, it was sticking through the ribcage of a skeleton, as if he used it to kill himself a long time ago. I picked it up and a text box appeared. "You got the hero sword. Will you be wise enough to use it for the right purpose?" At that point, a Majora's Mask style whiz robe, the old man type, appeared. He didn't move as fast as the one in Majora's Mask, and I was able to kill him easily with the sword. He slumped over, instead of exploding or fading as you'd expect a Zelda enemy to. Instead he said something. "You have taken my life, but I will be avenged. My pet will deliver my vengeance." The doors to the room locked, and I began to hear growling, and the sound of heavy feet running. This went on for at least 20 minutes. I was becoming more frightened than I should be for a video game character. Eventually, a gigantic wolf-oss burst into the room. I tried to fight it, but my sword seemed to have no effect. The wolf mauled Link to death, leaving a bloody corpse behind. The game froze on that shot, and there was no game over screen. I attempted to play the game again, but it never displayed anything except that final shot, no matter what I seemed to do.